Welcome to The Teacher's Story, a podcast dedicated to amplifying the voices of educators and advocates in the field of education. Here, we celebrate those who champion our children's potential and seek innovative approaches to nurture their brilliance. Join us as we share candid stories, explore impactful ideas, and showcase effective educational programs. This podcast stands for transparency, authenticity, and innovation, driven by the belief that we can revolutionize the education system to ensure every individual thrives. Together, let's redefine education as a pathway to human flourishing. Hi, welcome to The Teacher's Story. I'm Jackie Scully, and today we have Matthew Kincaid with us. He's an author of Freedom Teaching. I'm so excited to have another fellow author on the show and highlight his work and his ideas for education. I think we will have valuable lessons that are going to be shared in today's episode. So thank you, Matthew, for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So my first question I always start with is, what was your inspiration to get into education and like your passion for working with like kids or just in that realm?
Yeah, for me, I've actually been leading and teaching anti-racism work since I was like 14 years old. I actually detail that in the introduction of the book. And in a lot of ways, the work that I do now is more who I am than it is what I do. And so going into education, my passion was really about how can we make the school system work for all children. For me, I did not have a black male core content, black male core content teacher my entire education. I didn't have a black core content teacher after preschool until I was a senior in high school. And so being that there's less than 3% of the black male educators in this country are black, I was just very motivated by getting into classrooms and allowing students to see a black man, especially for the young black boys, to see someone like them teaching and see themselves represented in their curriculum.
Yes, thank you for that. I think that's so important because I do see that there is such a lack of diversity and especially even male teachers like within the profession. And there's, kids need to look up to their adult mentors and they want to see themselves in that adult mentor. And so I think that's really important to highlight that. Can you tell us a little bit about your book and what you focus on and how you want to see this kind of like in the school system?
Absolutely. I think the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And we've seen year after year, generation after generation, that our education system predictably fails the same subset of kids. I mean, one of the best indicators of a student's eventual ACT and SAT score is
Mhm.
not what their reading level is in third or fourth grade or what math scores they get by the time they're in sixth grade. It's a zip code that they're born into, which means in a lot of ways you have an 18-year head start on this problem. And so the book, which is called Freedom Teaching, focuses on how can we create an education system that works for all students, especially utilizing examples of how can we value the cultural wealth of all students, how can we create asset-based education models, especially for the students that our education system has traditionally, historically, and presently is failing, and how do we
Mm.
focus on cognitively empowering students by using examples in classrooms that are rigorous, but also relevant to their lived experience, that promote critical thinking, that promote problem solving, and really creating an education system where students can apply their learning in classrooms to their real lives. And so that's kind of the core thrust of the book. It's about radically reimagining what education is, but using practical tools to actually get educators in their classrooms to that space. So I hope that people read
Mm.
the book, recognize that it is a combination of both anti-racist theory, but it's also teaching practice from my own experience, but also the experience of working with educators across the entire country, teaching and leading around these particular ideas.
Yeah, and when you have that experience, you have the lived experience, you have the professional experience, and you can bring that with also the theories you talk about and the, professional development that you would like to probably see in schools through like your book and program. You're credible, and I think teachers will respect that because you are in the same position, right? You've been in the classroom. And I totally agree that we have this system of like, it's an insane system, right? It just keeps perpetuating itself. It's been the same since the 20th century, not changed much. And I talk about that often on this podcast, is that we keep doing things like it's the 1950s. And, it's like 21st century learning was the big buzzword in 2000. We're 2024 and there's still schools not doing it. It's not about technology. It's about what you're talking about. It's about the cognitive work, and it's about, you know, offering more opportunities for students to learn in different ways, because it's not just the content you teach. Like, I'm a history teacher and I very much believe in, you need to teach the truth and you can't remove things from curriculum. And that is a core part that needs to be focused on, but it's also how you teach children, because how you teach them is so inequitable as well. And like, lack of resources. And we could talk about that in the education system in America, which is based on zip codes, like you talked about, because of taxes. So could you give our listeners like a tangible example of like what could be transformed in curriculum, or how schools are actually run, or things that they are working on, like as far as different classes or projects, just so we can get some ideas of what you have in your book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, schools run based on this very simple social contract, which is that students exchange compliance, which means that they do what we ask them to do. There are rules and norms that exist in schools, and students are, for the most part, expected to comply to those things. In exchange for their compliance, then they're supposed to receive, in turn, an education and learning, right? And we tell students that by getting this education, all kind of different things are going to be better about their lived experiences. They're going to make more money. They're going to live longer. They're going to be healthier. In a lot of ways, especially for children in under-resourced communities, it's like, hey, all you have to do is just work hard in school, and everything about your life is going to take care of itself. And the thing about the social contract is that it works for most kids, right? And being that you have been a teacher before, you can attest to the fact that if kids ever in mass decided not to exchange their compliance, there's really nothing we as the educators could do about that. I mean, the power that we have in classrooms is really power that is ceded to us by kids. And so
Mm.
we in the book look at, okay, well, then who does this dynamic not work for? And you can start thinking about groups of students, like students of color, students who dealt with trauma, students with special needs, students who struggle academically, students who feel like their lived experience is not relevant, or so what they're learning in their classroom is not relevant to the things that they live in their daily lives. And if you were to flip this dynamic to being about, instead of being about like which students the social contract isn't serving, which is the list that I just mentioned, to which students who are disciplined most frequently in schools, is the exact same group of kids. And so we know over and over again the groups of students who, when they exchange their compliance, when they show up, when they're curious, when they're inquisitive, when they work hard, the data set still doesn't get back the same sense of education and learning, especially not one that's relevant to lived experience. We know the social contract is what is failing these kids, but instead of fixing that,
Mm.
oftentimes these are the same kids who we see face the greatest discipline disparities in schools. And so um, the book Freedom Teaching, as I said before, deals a lot with cognitive empowerment, which is utilizing teaching strategies that are asset based, that promote critical thinking, that promotes collaborative learning in classroom environments, that promotes students to learn how to problem solve, that is rigorous but also culturally relevant. And then another piece we talk a lot about comes from Tara Yoso's work, which is cultural wealth. And I think one of the things that's missing from many classrooms in the United States is that all students are taught to this kind of mythical norm, right? We're
Mm.
kind of educated within this school system that values middle class, Eurocentric, oftentimes patriarchal, heteronormative values. And every kid is meant to just acquiesce to that in terms of norms of behavior, but also in terms of the content and curriculum that they're learning. What that means is that for students who don't fit within that mythical norm, there's all types of cultural wealth that these kids are bringing into their classroom. Capital from their families, capital from the multiple languages they speak, capital from the social environments that they exist in within their culture. And so the book focuses on how can we leverage and access this cultural wealth that these students bring into classrooms. And instead of looking at these kids as broken vessels that we need to fix,
Mm.
understanding that these kids are coming in full and whole and expecting and experiencing education that is in alignment with, the perseverance that they've shown in their regular lives. And so we can meet them where they are, and we can meet them with a cultural lens that affirms who they are, and we can teach them in ways that are rigorous but also relevant to lived experience. The data says that students do better in environments like that. And so that's what the book tries to demystify, because it's not as complicated as we make it. Every classroom in the United States, in my opinion, teaches some value around, cultural affirmation. It's just that the cultural affirmation that exists in most schools is affirmation of the dominant culture. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's like, how can we also culturally affirm students who exist outside of that dominant culture? The book goes into depth about that as well.
Yeah, and I think it's important to put more agency into the students' hands, like giving them a lot of choice, giving them the sense that they can kind of like decide on how they want to create a certain project or whatever that's going to look like, maybe even something bigger in the school. Because I really believe that you have to tap into every single child's like brilliance and see them, like you said, as whole and not deficient. Like one thing that's always frustrated me is at the beginning of the school year, you might be going over like your roster and teachers either meet and go over, well, these are the things I saw wrong with the student when they were my student last year. And we start from the negative. We don't start from,
Right.
oh my gosh, look at this brilliance in this kid. And I think neurodiversity is a huge part of this conversation as well, because
Absolutely.
instead of looking at children on the spectrum or children who are dyslexic or whatever their reading disability or whatever that may be, is that it always starts from a default instead of saying, like, okay, that's just another way that they learn. And that means
Right.
that our schools need to be more diversified in our curriculum in the way that we teach, because we are teaching to the majority, to a norm. Like I love the concept of a mythical norm. And,
That's Toni
I taught,
Morrison, not me, just to be clear.
yeah,
Tony,
but thank
Tony,
you for
I heard that from Toni
bringing,
Morrison. Yeah.
yeah, thank you for bringing that up because it's so true. Like I asked my students, it's like, where do you think governments came from? Where do you think these laws came from? They're made up. Everything is made up. So if everything is made up, we can then create something new. And that's what we're trying to do. Do you ever do any like professional development or work with teachers or new teachers to see how maybe your book or what you're talking about can be implemented in schools?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I founded my organization Overcoming Racism in 2016, and we've now worked with tens of thousands of educators all over the country. We work with entire statewide school districts. We work with charter organizations. We work with traditional public schools, from the basis of a city. And so, yeah, we've worked with a really diverse set of teachers to learn how to implement this. And quite frankly, a lot of what I've learned from working with teachers and learning from teachers in my travels across the country, teaching about the benefits of anti-racism in classrooms informs what has gone into the book. So in a lot of
Mm.
ways, the people who've been a part of those workshops and those experiences, the people that we work to support in coaching, they also help to write this book as well. Because, what I found is that in my own work around trying to be an anti-racist practitioner and trying to figure out like, what does that exactly or explicitly mean both to me, but what does that mean in terms of the outcomes and the outputs that I receive back from my students? It did not take me long to find that a lot of the things that were out there to read was amazing at a theory level, but maybe some of the people had never implemented some of those theories in classrooms, or some of the pieces were extremely practical, but perhaps missing some of the theory and the analysis of what are the mindsets behind some of these practices. And so this book tries really hard through my own lived experience in my time in the classroom, but also by working with, educating, learning from educators all over the country. What does it mean to combine some of the best theory that's out there? Like, I cite Tara Yoso and Jeff Duncan Andrade and Gorlas and Billions and a number of other legends with that practice and what it means to actually implement these types of structures in classrooms. And I think that's what makes the book unique. It's also a fairly short and easy read. Being an educator myself, I recognize that many of us have, stacks and stacks of books that we ordered, had good intentions of reading. I wanted the book
Yes.
to be conversational. I wanted it to be relational. I wanted it to be an easy read, and I wanted to have, strategies that teachers feel like they could implement in their classrooms literally the next day. So that's what I've
Okay.
aimed to do, and that's been some of the feedback that we received.
That's wonderful because that's what teachers want. They want something practical, something like I can do this tomorrow. and you have the theory and like the practicality mixed together. I think that is like essential. Just another question I had that was kind of bouncing around my mind, because we live in a very divisive country. Well, kind of two-part. Why do you think it is so difficult for some areas of our country and schools to want to even implement curriculum that's anti-racist? And how do we change that? Like, how do we actually, because then what bothers me is that we are living in like two Americas. Like I talk about this often in my school because I teach at a private Quaker school, and we teach everything and it's very
Yeah,
diverse at my school. But then there's places in the country where it's like, if I lived here or I was there and I have friends all over, I couldn't talk about half of the things I talk about. I teach psychology. There's things in psychology I couldn't talk about. We all saw what happened with
right.
AP psychology in
Yeah.
Florida, and I was very upset about that. So yeah, if you want to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess to answer the question of why this work is quote unquote polarizing, it is because of misinformation. And I think that misinformation, the seed of it is actually because the work is extremely effective. What the data says, and there's limited data because we don't see like widespread implementation of ethnic studies or widespread implementation of culturally responsive practices across large districts. But in the places where this has been studied, what the data says is that it promotes students, especially students who are most at risk, to persist longer in school. It connects them. It increases their academic identity, meaning their relationship with school. Instead of feeling like school is being something that's being done to them, they feel like school is something that's being done with them. It We saw math and ELA scores go up in California when ethnic studies were implemented. And so I think one of the fears that people have is they want to maintain the status quo is probably the same fears that were propped up when we made any other educational progress, like integrating schools. And we saw people protesting against that. And the fight that came after that for curricular changes. And now the fight that's happening against these laws that are against critical race theory or against diversity, equity, inclusion, or social emotional learning strategies, or as you mentioned, psychology. I think that the misinformation is aimed at the masses to try to say that the way that these educational principles are being implemented in schools is divisive. But in reality, what is being communicated is that these parents don't want their kids to go to schools where they don't see people that look like them in their books and they don't have their history taught and that their stories are pushed to the margins of their children's education. Like these are the fears that parents are coming out with as they push back against things like critical race theory. Well, that's the education system that Black and brown kids have existed in since we formalized education in this country, and especially after schools integrated without any sort of supports around making sure that the curriculum was integrated as well. And so we're not
Mm,
asking for anything that is radical or revolutionary or whatever. We're asking for schools to work for our kids, and that shouldn't be something that's controversial. But the other thing is that the data says is that children who learn from diverse groups of people about diverse things and also learn about the cultural contributions of different people actually build strong relationships with people outside of their racial group. And so this is not just beneficial for children of color, it's beneficial for white children as well. Our country is steadily diversifying. Soon people of color will be the majority in this country. And I know that there are people who are working really hard to make sure that that process is slowed down, but it's just an inevitable fact of the way our country is trending. A student's ability to navigate diverse spaces is going to be just as important as their ability to read, write, and compute well. And so this is about
mm.
setting up all kids for success, not just children of color. And I think it's really unfortunate that this work is being weaponized and parents are being misinformed and they're going out and fighting against something they don't understand. I imagine the parents who look back and at the images of them standing outside of Central High School yelling at Elizabeth Eckford as she tried to walk into school. Many of them regret looking at themselves and saying, like, why would I stand in the way of integration? I don't know if people will regret book bans and fighting against critical race theory, whatever the case may be, but I do know that history is going to frown upon the fact that whenever we have this potential to move forward as it comes to making schooling work for all kids, we oftentimes see ourselves taking multiple steps backwards.
That is really well said. And that's a great reflection, right? Like you look at like generations that were doing that at that time and like we're blocking progress. And if you were to interview and ask them now, they probably would say that wasn't right for me to do that, or why did I have that mindset? It's the same thing now, 20 years from now, they could be reflecting on this experience that we've been going through with everything with like the school board conflicts and like the book bans, like you mentioned. I mean, the whole idea of banning books. I'm like, do we want to go back to fascism? Right? Like, I just have been in the World War II unit in my class, and I'm like, some of these things are parallel, and that's scary. And I tell my kids to pay attention, pay attention to these little signs because what happened in the 30s was not overnight. But then when it got to a certain point, it was overnight and it was a 180 and it was terrifying. So don't think that can't happen again. In a different way, it might not look the same, but the same ideology and mindset is withholding information. Only a certain group has access to whatever that society needs, and other people don't, and then other people are pushed out. And so it still happens in our culture today. So I think that's an important message. And I like the message is for all kids. It's working for all kids. And kids do learn more in diverse communities and with diverse books and conversations and opportunities. Um, we have these affinity groups in my school. We had a newspaper from like somewhere in Virginia. It was like a small newspaper, basically, in a way, bash our school for having these affinity groups, saying it was divisive. And I'm like, no, it's actually creating these safe spaces for kids to connect with each other. And then they do a lot of sharing in outside of that in like a diversity club or diversity committee. So yeah, it's just, I think fear. Fear is
Yeah.
always like that thing that's just like pushing against progress.
And I think it's fascinating that a person can identify an affinity space as being divisive, but that same person wouldn't identify a curriculum that only promotes one set of ideals and only promotes one group of people who came up with all the intellectual discoveries in the world and one group of people's story and history that's being taught from one particular angle. That's not divisive, but giving students a space where they can form an affinity because oftentimes they don't see themselves represented accurately within the media or within their curriculum is now divisive. The response to the stimulus is divisive, but the stimulus itself isn't. And so,
Mm.
whenever I kind of run into that type of mindset, then it's like, okay, this is fine. If you have a problem with the ways in which people of color, women, people LGBTQI plus community, the list goes on, try to repair harm from the damages of these oppressive systems, then you also have to have a critique of the systems themselves.
Mhm.
And I think that oftentimes that's where the conversation ends because it's not about whether or not you actually care what is divisive or what is not. It's actually about maintaining a racist norm and ideal that continues to suffocate progress for everyone. And when
Mm.
you look at the things that Black freedom movements have issued in over time in our country, is everything from voting rights to integration to disability access to LGBTQI plus rights to labor rights. I mean, pretty much every time Black folks have come together to fight for something through this progressive aim, it has moved our country closer to what our country said that it was going to be on paper. But yet, and still, every single time we face this massive opposition. And so I think the people who are opposing progress at some point have to look themselves in the mirror. But it's really hard to look yourself in the mirror if you've not been educated in a way to understand the realities of the history of this country. I think that's why many people in power have a vested interest in that education being banned, burned, hidden, and stifled because it
Mm.
actually is unifying and not divisive. And I think the more that we continue to put this perspective out, continue to write books like this that makes it accessible to people, the more we can have a real conversation about change.
Well, thank you so much. Just before we end here, any like final words about maybe the future for you and what you plan to do on the horizon with your book or any other, maybe other programs or books or getting into schools that you want to share?
Yeah, nothing specific. Overcoming racism. You can find us at Overcoming Racism on Instagram and pretty much Overcoming Racism on any social media channel. But in general, we're going to continue doing our work. Our work is around the idea of both envisioning and actualizing anti-racist change. We've been blessed to be able to do that in a number of institutions, not just school environments, but also healthcare spaces, corporations. The list goes on. The book Freedom Teaching is out now pretty much anywhere you can buy books. And so if you're interested in learning more, feel free to check that out. But also, if you go to our website, you can reach out to me directly and we can start a dialogue. I'm extremely grateful for your time, Jackie, to elevate this in critical work and to talk about my book. And I wish you all the best moving forward.
Thank you so much. And I will plug all of your information in the show
Thank
notes
you so
so
much.
that easy hyperlink, just go right to your website and go find Matthew Kincaid's book, Freedom Teaching. It is wonderful. It's so needed. And I'm just so glad we were able to share your story and your work today. And hopefully you will have more people reaching out and wanting to work with you. So thank you so much for coming on the Teacher Story.
Thank you for having me. And I hope this isn't the last time we get to hang out like this. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Thank you for tuning into The Teacher Story. Your support fuels my mission to shape a brighter future for our children. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, liking, and leaving a review. You can also support me by donating to my Buy Me a Coffee fund, linked in the show notes. Don't forget to explore my guests' work and show them your support. Together, we can make a difference in education. We do this in community. We rise together.